All right, I'm going to go ahead and begin. So, welcome everyone to our webinar, Unlocking Learning Blocks, Why Your Child Might Be Struggling in Reading and Math webinar. And so my name is Richard Capone. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Let's Go Learn. And today's webinar is going to be very specific. We're going to talk about how you could use assessment to figure out why is my child struggling in reading or math, or what do I do next? We're not going to be covering necessarily like curriculum, but really about how do I help my child? Right now, it's sort of an interesting time of the year because a lot of people sometimes start homeschooling around winter break. And so, or you may be concerned, how can I help my child if they're struggling? And so this webinar hopefully will help you figure out how to start. So here's our agenda. So we have a very simple agenda. This webinar is only 30 minutes. The first slide, I'm going to talk about who Let's Go Learn is, and then we're going to jump into reading, the foundational components of reading, the components of math, and then we'll do Q&A. And it's going to be a very fast-paced webinar. It is being recorded. We will send you a recording, and you will also get some links to some materials that I'm going to be referencing. Let's see here. So first of all, who is Let's Go Learn? So Let's Go Learn, I founded the company in 2000 with Dr. McCollum. Dr. McCollum ran the Reading Credential Program, and he taught teachers to become reading specialists. We took what he was doing in his field classes where they'd work with local schools, and we turned it into an application, which was, let's diagnose kids in reading and figure out, what do I do next as a teacher? How do I help that student who may be struggling? And so today we have some of the most diagnostic assessments on the market, as well as instruction tied into it. So it's really, really very helpful because a lot of assessments out there don't really tell you what to do next. They really just tell you whether somebody is struggling or not, right? And we're really about being actionable. All right. So first of all, I'm going to start off in reading right now. And it's interesting because when you start off with your child or someone who's learning to read, you don't realize that you think of reading as a single score. Like, oh, someone's reading at the 5th grade level or they're reading at college level. But it really is, reading uses multiple skills. So it is not a single skill, it's multiple skills. And it turns out 25% of kids have some difficulty when learning to read. So it's nothing wrong with the student or the child who maybe struggles. It's very common, and so we have to recognize that. So in order to accommodate this, you need different instructional approaches, right? So it may vary. Some students will have strengths, some will have weaknesses. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'll give you some examples later on that. But the key is analyzing your child's strengths and weaknesses, and that's really, really important because you need to be able to figure out, oh, okay, this is the approach I need to take. Or if you're buying curriculum or you're using different things, or even for yourself, if you're directly teaching or helping your child, you need to understand that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. All right, here we go. All right, so first of all, what are the components of reading? And so this chart here may be a little confusing at first, but I'm going to talk about it and explain it to you. So you have to think about reading as a series, I told you, as a series of skills and knowledges. So if we look at the very bottom, what we consider some of the foundational skills is your ability to decode. And I'm going to break this out later. So how do you take words on the paper and how do you turn it into words that you understand, right? That's decoding. Vocabulary is how do I take words and understand what the words mean. Comprehension strategies is taking a look at a series of sentences together and then actually being able to comprehend what is going on in the story or the passage. And of course, grammar is another piece. You need to have grammar so you understand future tense, past tense, and different things like that. But all of these together allow you to comprehend. So in a sense, we're moving upward in this graph. I'm starting off with these skills, and then in the end, it allows me to have comprehension, right? And so what you're going to try to do is understanding these pieces and components and break them apart. Now, as a diagnostic assessment company, this is what we do, right? Working with Dr. McCollum in 2000, when we were developing Let's Go Learn, we created an assessment that actually did this automatically. And you guys do have the ability to even purchase that from us to use it with your own kids. But a lot of it you could do on your own, and I do think it's still important to understand it. All right. Now, I want to use this example because you may say, well, I don't really quite understand how this works together. And I like using this example of my ability to comprehend French, right? I took French in high school and in college. but I don't really use it, and that was a long time ago. So today, in French, it's actually very phonetically regular. So I can actually read French really well. I could decode it in a sense. But my vocabulary is very, very low. So I have this gap here. My vocabulary is probably like a third grade level, fourth grade level, if even that. So there's a lot of words I just don't know what they mean. Oops, sorry. Comprehension strategies. I'm a good English reader. So if you give me a complicated sentence, I could process it. If you give me a long passage, yeah, I could read and understand main idea and all that. So my comprehension strategies are good because I know I'm a good reader. But my grammar is actually weak too because I don't remember all the future tenses, past tenses, conditional, irregular conjugations. And so that is weak on it. So overall, my comprehension is low. So this is a great example. Even though, I'm a good reader per se, but because of these weaknesses in these two areas, my comprehension suffers. So this is just an example of how you have to look at reading. And that's going to be happening for your children. One more example, both of my kids were very different readers. My son was a great decoder, but his comprehension strategies was a little weak. He didn't really process what he was reading. So he'd read the words, and then I'd ask him, do you know what it meant? And he didn't understand. Versus my daughter was the opposite. She struggled a little bit with decoding, but she was so methodical that as she was reading, she would really think about everything, and her comprehension was good. So it's funny. Two kids, same household, very different, right? All right. So let me now break this apart for you and just make sure we're good on time. All right. So the first part I mentioned was within decoding, there's high frequency words. So this is just some screen captures from our website. But high frequency words are those words that students are supposed to memorize, right? Because they're not regular, or they happen so often you don't want people to decode them. So initially they have to learn to decode them, but I'll give you an example. That's not a regular word. If you look at the phonics, you would say it's not the. So you have to know that's it's a phonetically irregular word, and really it's good to memorize those. And this is something that you would call a phrase list or the Dolch sight word list. And so those are things to teach your students, your child, that they're learning to read. But again, it's supposed to be when they look at it, the way you assess them is you give them a bunch of words and they have to immediately recognize it. You want them to immediately see the, of, a, and, but, right? And when they see it, they immediately recognize it over time. So that is called high frequency words. Very important to learn those. The next thing is just we call word recognition. So this is just taking words from first grade level up to 12th grade level, and those are common words, but not the high frequency words that appear the most often. These are less frequently words. And so this is just something to build up your child's word recognition ability. This is a second subtest in our assessment where we give you a grade level score on that. Now the third subtest of decoding is phonics. This is when you're learning beginning sounds, short vowel, beginning blends, long vowel. Again, there's a scope and sequence of this, and we have this information on our website. But you could say, how do I teach phonics? You could look it up, and there's a whole series, standard scope and sequence of how you teach it. But these are words, using these skills to sound out words. So in our assessment, they may hear a word, mouth, and then they have to click on the word that they hear. That's how we assess it, and then we go through a series. And what we do is we actually test certain skills, like maybe beginning sounds, then we go into short vowel, beginning blends, long vowel. And so that's something that what you could do too when you work with your child. There's certain rules you want to just make sure that they understand, and you're going to step through it. So that's the third thing is phonics. Now, a lot of emphasis on phonics, right? Because when you come to a tricky word, phonics is what you use to first try to figure out what that word is, right? So phonics skills are very important because that's a lot of times your first line of attack. Here's a word, I don't know what it is. How do I decode it? All right. Now, what we do in our assessment too is we actually use some real words and some non-words. But that's just because sometimes we're trying to be a little bit more scientific. Sometimes if somebody already knows a word, like if I already know the word mouth, I've seen it, I know it, then if I see the word and I read mouth, you don't know if I really understand, all the individual phonics. I may just be looking at that and repeating it. But in our assessment, we sometimes use we call them nonsense or fake words, non-real words. we do that sometimes to isolate where someone really knows the phonetic principle. And you could do that too at home if you want to know whether your child really understands a blend. So BL, you want to know if they know blah. In a word context, you could just make up a word and see if they can read it. All right, the next thing we have in our assessment is phonemic awareness. This is something you could even test with your child. Some students have phonemic awareness challenges. And cat. What is the middle sound in the word cat? Can they actually pull out, that's k, at, ah. Can they pull out the ah? Now, there's a bunch of stuff. There's addition, deletion, substitution, identification, categorization, blending, segmentating, isolating, rhyming. There's a lot of stuff to phonemic awareness. But these are some things that if you ever wonder, it's something you could start asking your child. And sometimes you'll find some students legitimately, when they hear a word, they cannot pull that sound out. And it has to do with just a wiring maybe of the brain where it's just the auditory processing. So again, and that will actually make it harder for kids to learn phonics. So just be aware that's something that is good to know about. And people don't realize it. Phonemic awareness is interesting. And also, in 25% of students who are dyslexic, it's it's an auditory processing issue, right? All right, the next thing is vocabulary. This is really important. Vocabulary, again, like I was talking about my French example, if you don't have a good vocabulary, then you really can't understand the text you're reading. And this is really, and so we have a leveled test. We go up and we try to find out where is the student's vocabulary level out. And so, in a picture, they would say, click on the picture of tools, and then they'd have to be able to sort of figure out which one are tools. And I just sort of made that up, but that's the way this kind of assessment works. All right, the next one we do is we do a spelling test. This is more advanced in some ways. I mean, spelling's important, but spelling is harder than decoding. So when you decode a word, you look at it and you try to sound it out, but spelling is encoding. So if I say book, I'm reading my favorite book, please spell book. Somebody could spell it some different ways phonetically, right? They could say B-O-O-C. But if I get it right, B-O-O-K, it tells me that this student has been exposed to words and, maybe they do have some good phonics skills. So it's a reflection of their exposure to regular and irregular word patterns. And so it's interesting to see. And of course, you do want students to be able to spell, especially when they're sending an email, right? All right, the next thing is comprehension. This sort of brings it all together. They read a passage. In our assessment, we actually stick with nonfiction and longer passages because we want to sort of predict how is a student going to do when they have to do content reading in school. And so they read a passage. When they're done, they hit done. They can't go back. And then we have a bunch of questions. So as you assess your child, realize not all reading comprehension is the same. There's not one type. If I read a directions and I try to put together an IKEA desk I bought, that's different than if I'm reading a book and then the next day I have to come back and discuss that book with someone. Or if I'm in a book club and I read something and then we're talking about it, right? That's a different type of, there's different types of comprehension. So just be aware that when you assess your child, think about what type of assessment passages. Also, fiction is in general easier than nonfiction, right? So when you have certain passages that are exactly the same level, it varies. So one thing about reading is that there is readability. Readability refers to the number of syllables in words, the number of words in sentences, and as they get more complicated, so as you have sentences with more phrases and there's more words in them, the readability goes up. And so readability is, from first grade up to college level, there's a couple things. Flesch-Kincaid is readability and also Lexile, right? And all our passages are leveled. All right. So I'm going fast, but don't worry, we're recording this and you'll be able to look back on it. Okay, so that is about reading. Hopefully I gave you some good, solid, basic information, understanding about the components of it, right? Now let's move into math. So math. Foundational math is very skills-based, and this is interesting. There's a lot of skills inside of it. And what do I mean by that? Skills are going to be lots of things you need to learn. How do I do 2-digit by 1-digit? Do I know 2D objects, 3D objects? All right. The other piece now is concepts. Concepts can and must be learned. So concepts is more something like area, the area of a square, and then volume is going to be the volume within a jug of milk. So there's concepts that need to be learned as well. Now, the mastery of concepts, right, requires the skills and the conceptual understanding. And I think this is really important to understand. So that's why a lot of times, there's this push sometimes and say, hey, we really need to work on the concepts. But the thing is, if you don't also take the time to fill in the gaps of the skills, mastery never happens. And so math is very complicated in that regard. And part of the problem is modern math is very broad. And there's so much to learn. So what we have found is that a lot of people, especially in middle school, they're like, my child is failing in math. It's very common, and they don't know what to do. So one of the most searched keywords is middle school math curriculum, or helping my middle school math student. It's very common. People Google that. And and this is the reason why, is because it's difficult. Now, sorry. Okay, so here's a visualization of math, right? Math is often broken up into these 5 strands: numbers and operations, measurement, geometry, data analysis, and algebraic thinking, right? Those are areas within each of these. Now, the problem is there's some assessments out there that they give you scores in each of these. They'll say, oh, Richard took the assessment in numbers and operations. He's, at 3rd grade level. In measurement, he's at 4th grade level. The problem with that still doesn't tell you what to do, because each of these has lots of skills within it. So the area of this green rectangle sort of corresponds to a number of skills and concepts that need to be taught. So this is accurate. We took all the skills and concepts within foundational math and we broke it up into an area representation of this, right? And so I put numbers and operations at the bottom because you need numbers and operations in order to do measurement, in order to do geometry, right? I can't do area of a square or triangle if I don't know how to do multiplication, right? I can't do data analysis if I don't understand usually, percentages and fractions, right? So that's what this is. So you got to realize math is sort of like a foreign language. It builds on itself. And so you really have to realize that. Okay, this is sort of an interesting thing. And this is what happens to a lot of kids. Like by the time someone's in middle school and they're struggling, they have all these weird little gaps. They didn't quite understand a concept. They didn't get this or that. And so as a result, these gaps down here percolate into these upper areas, and they're never able to reach full mastery, which is going all the way up to the top, right? So literally this is what happens. They start hitting a ceiling. So they're teaching in 6th grade, they're learning about 6th grade concepts, but the problem is they have so many little gaps that it just weighs them down. Cognitively, when someone's talking about some concept, they're thinking in the back of their mind, wait, how do I get the area of a triangle again? And then they get lost, right? So by 6th grade, if somebody is non-proficient by state standards, they're usually lost in their math class. Okay. All right. This is sort of a scary photo or image, but this is our map. And this link right here goes to this Google Sheet. And in this Google Sheet, this shows the 44 subtests of foundational math. Like this one here, you can't read this, but this is numbers, place value, comparing and ordering, addition of whole numbers. So each one of these, it says, when you do addition of whole numbers, how do you teach it? You teach, addition of 1 digit, 2 digit, 3 digit, non-regrouping with regrouping, right? And so this is a great thing for you to download and keep handy. And there's 2 documents. One is like this, and one is a PDF of just it listed in a straight singular document, so you can reference it. And what you could do it for is if your child, you ever say, hey, do you understand fractions? And you see what they can do, and then you can see where they're at in the scope and sequence that tells you what you need to teach next, right? Because things are sequential the way you teach it. If I know how to add fractions with like denominator, I next need to move into adding fractions with unlike denominator. But before I do that, I need to learn least common denominator, right? So there's different skills I need to learn, and this literally maps everything out. You could look it up. What does it mean, least common denominator? How do I teach that? You just Google it, right? So this is a great document for you guys to reference. That is, I think, almost it. Hopefully, I know math, I went sort of fast, but really the main takeaway is modern math is very broad. Numbers and operations is really the foundational skill of it. You need to make sure, and then, yes, spend time on teaching those concepts, but don't forget, you also have to fill the gaps, take the time to go back. And that is what makes it's a good stumbling block or big stumbling block for students who struggle. Okay, so if you want more information on our tools, you could scan this QR code, and we have our math assessment, our reading assessment, our instruction, math instruction and reading instruction, and you could jump to it. You could take an assessment in 1 hour. Math could take longer for older kids, but you can have a full diagnostic report, a 1-page report or a 10-page report, and it'll help guide your instruction. It's also, like I said, part of it, even if you did it one time, you look at the report, it'll help you. In some ways, you need to know how to do it on your own too. So anyway, I think it's really important for you to understand that, especially if you're teaching your child or if you're trying to tutor them. Our reports are written really, really everyday language, so it's really good for that. Again, if you, we will email you. If you sign up for the webinar, we email you the video. And I'm going to go ahead, let me take some questions here. Okay, so one of the questions is, here's an interesting one. We're using IXL, and they have a test built into it. How does this differ from that? Well, IXL, the problem with that, it doesn't have a full-blown diagnostic, so it's sort of like you're throwing instruction at your kid, and you're giving them a bunch of test practice. What we try to do is start off with analysis, right? Like when you go to the doctor, they want to ask you a series of questions and find out what's going on before they give you a prescription, right? So, or figure out what you should do. So that's our approach. We don't just throw, because a lot of times if you just throw instruction at a student, if it's way too hard for them, it doesn't matter. It's hard and they're not going to learn it, right? And so that's the one difference there. Okay. So what kind of reports does your reading assessment have? So in our reading assessment, we have a summary report, which is going to show those subtests I showed you. It will give you a grade level score in each of those. So high frequency words, second grade, word rec, 5th grade, phonics, 1st grade, and so on and so forth. But we also have a detailed report that actually explains everything and then actually gives you some prescriptions. So there's a 1-page report, or I think it's like 5-page. But that's the kind of report we have. And then I think we also have the report in Spanish as well, if somebody wanted that. Okay. Now the question is, let's see here. All right, your math assessment, how long does your math assessment take for a 1st grader? Okay, so yeah, I mentioned we have 44 subtests, but for a 1st grader or someone who's young, the assessment's going to be very fast, 15 to 20 minutes, right, at most. But what happens is our assessments don't have a cap. So if your child's advanced, they'll start taking the assessment. It'll keep going further and further until they hit a ceiling condition. Then it moves on to the next subtest. So it takes that much. But the flip side is if you're somebody who's in 7th or 8th grade or a 6th grader, the assessment could be about an hour to hour and a half. Now, one thing about giving the math assessment is you need to teach your children or student you're tutoring potentially. If you don't know the question, move on. Because what you don't want someone to do is to spend 5 minutes on trying to figure out what is the square root of 9. Well, if they don't know what the square root of 9, that it's 3, right away, you don't want them sitting there for 5 minutes trying to figure it out. So just be aware, some kids who are very tenacious, you need to tell them, hey, this assessment's adaptive. It's going to come across things you don't know. If you don't know it, then just guess and move on. All right, so that's one thing I want to really stress, because you don't want kids to get stressed out about it. Once you have this information, it's going to be very, very powerful for you. All right. Let's see here. How does your instructional system work in terms of assigning lessons to students? Okay, so that's a good one. So based on the assessment data, we actually generate a course for every student in math and ELA. And so we look at the data, we look at the gaps, and we assign them the lessons that fill in the gaps. And what it does is it focuses on the lowest skills first. So if you're a 6th grader and you have some gaps at the 3rd grade level, those lessons will appear first. And by doing that, our assessment really gets students up to speeds very quickly. Now in reading, if somebody is very good in decoding, they're not going to get any decoding lessons. They're just getting maybe comprehension strategies. Also, in reading, once someone has nailed down foundational reading, we're not going to recommend lessons. They're going to be done, right? So just be aware of that. I think that's it. I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much for attending. I have my email address there. Again, that QR code will take you to the Homeschool Retail page where you could actually look at our assessments, our math assessment, reading assessments, and then also the instruction. All right. Thank you so much.